And once again, we caution you. These stories are definitely not for the timid soul. So we tell you calmly and very sincerely, if you frighten easily, turn off your radio now.
When you die, your life flashes and you disintegrate, radiating energy. When a thing turns into its opposite, when love becomes hate, there are always sparks. But when life turns into death, it's explosive. There are streaks of light, magical and electrifying. Everyone senses something, some energy, some spirit, some sort of illumination. But I see it. I've seen bodies shining like stars.
Thom Carnell, and we're going to talk about Tom's experience as a funeral director. So, Tom, welcome.
Thank you to my own show. That's kind of awesome.
The first question, obviously, is people want to know what kind of background you have.
I came from a background that is mostly horror movie related and by way of Tower Records. And about the time that I got married at the age of 28, I needed a job that would suit me better and provide for my family better than Tower Records did. I had always been around funeral directors because our family knew someone that had done it, and his family had done it for years. And I just thought with my ability to watch pretty much anything film-wise, that Mortuary College was a way that I could both satisfy that part of me that didn't mind being around that kind of a thing, or so I thought, and also helping people at a time when their lives were pretty much coming apart. The idea of forging order out of chaos was really important to me, and that sort of led me to the school I went to, which was the San Francisco College of Mortuary Science.
Tell me a little bit about that school. How long were you attending there?
The program was a year long, but it was a really intensive year. It later got expanded to a 2-year program in certain schools, but San Francisco College wanted to keep it to a year, which meant you could do little else because you were pulling a huge load of varying different topics, and you really went to school all day. Maybe in second semester you did some lab work, but then it was home and you really had to hit the books after that.
What kind of classes would you have there?
The classes went from everything that you would expect, embalming, restorative art, funeral law, that kind of thing, to microbiology, to like sort of health sciences, to being able to understand a diagnosis based on the kind of the word it was, the pieces of the word, the syllables, if you will. And everything went from that to accounting, to how to run a business, to the psychology of how to deal with families and grief and that kind of thing. So it was kind of all over the board, which really kept you jumping. And it was tough. I'll tell you, it was really tough. I did my best that I could there, and I pulled a 3.67 grade point average, which many people couldn't do. For example, first semester there were 30 students in our class. When it came time for second semester, there was 9.
Wow.
So the attrition rate was huge. Either people couldn't cut it academically, or the reality of what they were doing started to hit home. And we lost a lot of people that way.
I would imagine that some of the classes, they would want to give you, some sort of emotional counseling kind of.
Oh, no, none of that. It was none of that. It really was, we assumed that if you're here, you kind of want to be on board. And of course, and that was kind of said in jest, but of course the teachers were keeping an eye out for someone who wasn't handling it well. because it's really hard to have your nose rubbed in your own mortality day after day after day after day. Never was a day that I didn't show up to work and think that this could easily be me or someone that I care about. So you sort of look for cracks in people, like either they are all business and no, like, I don't want to say levity, because never was humor made at the expense of someone, but...
So do you feel, you talk about like the curriculum, just like the pace of it being very grueling, obviously the emotional side of it is difficult. What else was kind of hard on you during that time when you were in school?
I was really lucky, and the fact that the dean of students was a great guy and became a friend, a guy named Bob Yount. He kind of could see that there were people that were in it for certain reasons. Some were more libertine than others. For example, it could be fast money. You could make money. You can own your own place or whatever. So people were there for the financial end. But there were other people there that were there for the idea of, like, I really want to help people. Those are the ones that usually made the better funeral directors, because they never lost sight of the fact that there were people at the other side of the table from you. But, you know, Bob was great. Bob knew my situation and, in fact, arranged it that the first case I ever did prep work for was an infant that was literally the same size and shape and coloring and sex and everything of my daughter who had just been born. You know, I put his hand on my back and said, if you could do this, you can do anything. And I did it, but I cried the entire time and was a mess.
It was kind of a dick move.
Kind of a dick move. On the other hand, it was the equivalent, I think, of a gym teacher pushing you into the deep end and teach you how to swim.
Right.
It literally was jumping with both feet, and you're either going to be able to do this or you're not.
When you talk about getting into it because you want to help people, that doesn't seem like something that normally people would think of, where, you know, you have empathy and compassion is what pulls you into that business.
So, well, some people, I mean, no one's blatantly being, you know, a jerk, but you can tell, you know, the guy who's been doing it for 20 years, that sort of gets blunted a little bit, and may very well be why, you know, there's a lot of alcoholism in the field and that kind of thing. But and then no matter how hardened you think you are, there's always going to be that one family, that one case that slips in under your radar and just decimates you mentally, you know?
Mm-hmm. So when you were at school, what kind of other people were there to go into school with you?
We had everyone from the very religious, because that's what it was a calling to them. We had people who had, and working in funeral homes, had been in their family forever. Their father did it, their grandfather did it. And we even had a guy that used to be a cruise line magician that just decided that he was going to do funeral service and did, and, you know, graduated, and I assume he's still working in the field.
Wow. Once you get out of school, is there an accreditation process that you have to go through?
There's a series of sort of hoops you have to adjust to. One is tenure. You know, you have to be doing it as an apprentice for a while. And then there's tests. There's like a state board exam and a national board exam that you have to take. I took my nationals, and the nationals were an 8-hour test that were brutal. And that covered everything from, like I say, from accounting to funeral law to, you know, how do you do this? How do you clear a tissue of this? How do you prepare for a person that's coming in with this disease or whatever? Mm-hmm. So it was tough. It was a really tough quiz.
Was it all practical or just written?
It was all written. And then once you passed that, you would go and usually either continue or start your apprenticeship. And that's where you would be actually dealing with families and dealing with prep work and that kind of thing. And usually a lot of those apprentices get the lower echelon kind of jobs. They do a lot of cleaning. They do a lot of laundry, because you go through a lot of bleachy laundry. And they're the ones that do first calls, which are the times when someone has died and they get a phone call and someone has to go out to the home or to the hospice or to the hospital or what have you and pick up the body and bring it back. at which point they usually will try to get permission to do embalming if there's going to be embalming, just because the sooner that you start that process to the time the person dies, the better the results are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
how does the decision to embalm come about? Like, what's involved in that? Is there something that you have to do, or you have an option of doing it?
Well, it gets really legally, for want of a better word, but basically the rule of thumb is this: if you are having a funeral and the casket is closed, or if you're having a viewing or visitation or whatever, and the casket is closed, you don't have to do embalming. But the minute that you open it up and expose the body to the general public, you start to get into this dicey water of communicability and just in general being antiseptic enough where someone can not only be around someone who may have passed away because of a contagious disease, but also it sort of helps present a more appealing image because there's a lot of problems when someone dies with the postmortem settling of blood. And, for example, Marilyn Monroe died. When she died face down. So by the time the coroner got to her and started to see what was going on, her face all the blood had settled to her face. So that wouldn't have done. So they had to get that sort of cleared out pretty quickly, because there's two sort of things going on. One is postmortem lividity, which is the gravitational settling of blood to the lowest thing. So whatever's the lowest, whether it's your feet or your back, if you're on your back, whatever, the blood settles. That's one thing. And then there's something that's referred to as postmortem stain. And staining is when the red blood cells themselves burst, and they actually they tend to tint the tissue. You have to remember that someone has died, and usually it wasn't a situation where that person planned on it. Yes, some people are diagnosed terminally, some people are brought into hospice, but a lot of people, that first twinge of pain in their chest and their left arm going numb is the first time they ever considered the fact that this ride tends to stop. And collaterally, you've got the family who is very much in that same mind. So, funerals give the family an opportunity to come together, get that closure, and also to remember and honor the deceased's life. Usually, that gets tied up with religion and that kind of thing because of the afterlife thing. That's not my concern, because that is so not what I'm about. Not me personally, which it is, but on the other hand, as a funeral director, it doesn't matter to me. You want to come in and do a Jewish service? Fine. You want to do a Muslim service? Fine. Catholic, Hindi, whatever you want to do, we're okay with it as long as it's within the parameters of the law. So it sort of gives that closure. It gives the due honor to the person who has died and sort of helps the family take that first step towards recovery.
Right.
Now, personally, I have sort of an issue with, I don't like open casket funerals. I think they become very sort of ghoulish, but that's me. But the person that walks up and says, damn it, I want an open casket service, you got to give it to them. It's not up to you, the funeral director, to say, really? That's kind of weird, macabre, or whatever. You just go with it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a story I had, a young girl who brought in her father's clothes and the clothes he wanted to be buried in. And it wasn't up to me to decide about those clothing, even when she gave me a taffeta dress.
Wow.
So it's like, if that's who Dad was, that's who Dad was. And it's so not my business to judge or try to influence that decision making, other than saying we can do that. Remember, at the end of the day, mortuaries and funeral homes and cemeteries, they're a business. So at the end of the day, I can say, we can put Dad in that gown, but it's going to cost X number of dollars because it's man hours. Here we enter the arena that personally I started to have issue with, and that issue sort of grew as the time went on.
So is that something that you want to talk about at this point, or do you want to wait until later? So what is
Sure.
it? What was it that sort of caused you to leave the field?
During the time I was in the field, it was changing. It was changing from the local funeral home that was owned by a family that had owned it forever and knew the value that they were giving to their community. At this point, a company called Service Corporation International, or SCI, started to come in, and it was a big, giant corporation that just started buying up funeral homes and buying up cemeteries and modeling them. I hate to say like McDonald's, but it was kind of like that. You had a certain assortment of caskets. You had a certain variety of services, and everything cost. And it was usually, in some funeral homes, there is a propensity to quote-unquote sell up. And what that means is, I have a cloth-covered casket here that's really the bottom of the line that I can sell you for $695 at the time. That's what it ran, $695. Or I could sell you up to the $1,200 metal casket. Mm-hmm. The funeral home would love you to sell that $1,200 because it's a wider profit margin. They would rather that you direct everyone towards the cemetery's gift shop because there was built-in profit to that, mm-hmm. and we got a piece of that. For me, what happened was there was a young girl who was maybe 17, and her two siblings who were quite a bit younger. Both of their parents were killed in a car accident, and they had no money. So I sold them the bare minimum of what they needed, and was chastised by my manager because I should have sold up. This is where you step in and you say, look, sometimes it's not about money and it's not about profit, and sometimes it's just about doing the right thing. My statement of that fell on deaf ears. That was the first sign that I needed to leave. The second sign was every day I would usually come home and take a couple of minutes, or on the way home, take a couple of minutes and just sort of get it out. I'd sit in my car and you cry for 5 minutes and sort of get it out so that you don't come home, and you try not to bring all that shit home to your family because they're sort of innocent bystanders in that. It's a given that you're going to bring some of it home. But the day I stopped having those moments, I knew I was becoming hardened and knew that it was time, that the funeral industry was heading in a direction that I didn't want to go. And so I left.
So going back to, we were talking about funerals and practical purpose. Obviously there's preparations that you have to go through that you really need to for funerals. Like, you can talk a little bit about the differences of burial versus cremation.
Okay. It's a uniquely personal decision. I know people that want to be cremated, straight up. And other people, it just seems barbaric to them. And they're sort of drawn to the ritual of it or the tradition of it. This is the way we buried Grandpa, and this is the way we buried Dad, so this is the way I want to be buried. They're both viable. It all sort of speaks to that person's personal philosophies. And again, as a funeral director, it's like, all right, yeah, you want cremation? Let's do that. That's the road we go down. The whole process is a series of forks in the road. The way it sort of goes down is this. Telephone calls made to the funeral home, either their night service answers or someone on call answers. They get the information that a death has occurred. They go to pick that person up. At that point, if there's family around, you'll ask, have you thought about disposition? Meaning, do you want cremation or burial or what have you? If the family, usually they don't know because they're shell-shocked because they just found out that mom had died. So it usually waits. But you try to get permission if there's going to be embalming right then and there, as I said before. Usually the next day, the family will come in for an arrangement conference. The arrangement conference is basically It's the money and the planning stuff. This is the kind of service we want. We have our own minister. We have our own, my nephew plays guitar and he's going to come in and sing a song or whatever it is going to be. The funeral home usually keeps people on retainer that are usually like chaplains or Navy chaplains or that kind of thing, where one man can do a lot of different services. Navy chaplains can conduct a Baptist, a Catholic, a Protestant, or what have you. So the conference is about trying to understand what the service is and unfortunately attaching a price tag to it. Much like weddings, the wedding they want and the wedding they get sometimes differs.
Right.
When you start seeing price tags on stuff. And again, sadly, this all has a price tag. Then once the service is planned, and then things start happening behind the scenes where you have the prep room. If they're doing cremation, they'll usually wash the person, maybe dress them, maybe not. It depends. Or they start the embalming process or what have you. Sometimes in the case of, let's say, Orthodox Jewish people and Muslim people in certain religions, you're under a time crunch because they need to be interred within 24 hours. And there's all these rules to everything. So you have to sort of meet those requirements, but also you've got legal requirements and you've got emotional requirements and all of this kind of stuff. Then there's planning on as far as interment goes, filing of paperwork, getting everything set, and then you start scheduling staff to be ushers or to be the funeral director of note on the day, and it goes straight on through with arranging the cemetery and then getting them the permits they need so they can break ground on the gravesite and that kind of thing. So there's a lot going on that you sort of only have one shot at doing it right. Because much like weddings, man, if you screw up someone's funeral for whatever reason, even if it wasn't meant to be, that's an image that stays with that entire family forever.
Well, and not only that, but I can imagine like the funeral home itself would be a lot nervous about liability.
And there's usually, because there's that on the table in that, when you start talking about litigation against funeral homes, on the table is this weird, nebulous thing, emotional distress, where, for example, there was a service that was being held. It was a large mausoleum. On one end, there was a very stoic Christian service going on, and someone didn't think. And on the other end of the mausoleum, they scheduled Hispanic service, and Hispanic people a lot of times will bring mariachi bands to their funerals.
Yeah.
So now you've got on one end of the building someone that wants quiet and reverence, and another one where it's has a different tone.
Right.
And
a little more party atmosphere.
Yeah, well, yeah, more of a true celebration of the person's life. But now to the stoic people, all they hear is all I hear is a mariachi band during Mom's quiet, solemn service.
Right.
Now, emotionally, that devastated me, and I think I need compensation. So, there's that kind of thinking. But you're right, because funeral homes are always worried about that, because they know that the simplest mistakes can cause a lot of trouble.
Are there ever special circumstances?
In the preparation of the body? Yeah, I mean, you're trying to match the memory of a living person with the reality of what you have. And what you have is sort of a shell. So there's that. Certain special circumstances could be everything from trying to cover a head wound from a car accident, which would enter into the realm of restorative art, where you're trying to fix structurally what happened. Then you've got clothing, then you've got makeup, then you've got hair, then you've got biological problems. For example, someone with jaundice. If you have someone in your prep room that has died and jaundice was a part of their condition, if you embalm them normally, as you would everybody else, there's a chemical reaction where the person, while their skin was a little yellow from the jaundice, you embalm them, and now you've got someone who's green. Like, not luminous green, but it's pretty close.
Right.
It's something you could never present to a family. So it's that kind of thing, getting all the information, figuring out, like, what do we need to do. Some people, for example, it's as simple as the person was overweight. Therefore, their body mass is going to have more water. That water is going to dilute your embalming fluid, so you have to sort of make adjustments there. So there's always little subtleties that go on, and in the end, you're hoping that your finished product, I hate to use that term, but your finished product is one that is aesthetically pleasing to the bereaved, so that you're not causing them even more distress. Because you hear that all the time, right? About, oh my God, it doesn't even look like her.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't even think that there are many times that people are really happy with how their loved one looks, would you say? Or
Absolutely. Well, I think it's one of those things where it's like, well, it's not that it's good enough, but it's like, on one hand, they want it to look like mom. On the other hand, they know there's been a change. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So a lot of times you also have to remember that most funeral, and this is changing now, but a lot of funeral homes and a lot of embalmers are run by men. And you get, your mom there, and most men have a really ham-fisted understanding of the subtleties of facial makeup.
Mm-hmm.
So they tend to think the same way they did when they were a 10-year-old and thought if a little cologne smells good, a whole lot will smell really even better. They tend to be really heavy-handed. And so when you hear complaints, it's like, oh my God, they tarted mom up or whatever.
That's not good to hear.
Yeah, so usually you would have someone in there that would step up and go, be the makeup person.
Right.
And sometimes they do that. They'll hire in people to come in to do someone's hair, or someone's makeup, or what have you.
You only have to do the front, though.
Right.
So tell me about some of the interactions that you had with families that have really made an impression on you.
I'll say this about my experience. Even the people who were difficult, I always felt it was an honor to be in the room. You're brought into a family dynamic at the ground floor, and no one's putting on airs, and no one's trying to impress you. So you really get a slice of what life is really like for these people.
Right.
Number one. So in the midst of all this chaos and death and horrible stuff, I never did a service that didn't have at least one moment that was just heartrending, where, for example, there was a lady there. She had sort of sleptwalked through the entire process of the burial of her husband, who they'd been married like 50 years or something. So her family was there and sort of helping her along and saying, well, we'll do this and we'll do this. And she was just nodding a lot. So at the service, she was sitting in the front row, and the service had concluded, and everyone got up and left. And she was still sitting there. So I walked up to her and I sat down next to her because I had talked to her throughout the process. And I asked her, well, we're kind of done, so we're going to go to the cemetery now. And she looked at me and with these wide eyes just said, I don't know what to do now.
Yeah.
And I had to be there and say, and walk this line of being like, first of all, when someone says that to you like that, wow. There's just like, it's like a kick in the chest that you
right.
And you want to say the right thing, and sometimes the right thing to say is nothing. And, it'll all, platitudes like, it'll all be okay, it'll all be all right, are completely empty when someone's just lost the most important person in their life. So all you can do is sort of, tell them, I know it's going to be hard, but, whatever. There's that. There's the other, a gentleman who's a sort of captain of industry, got kind of guy, business suit, took no bullshit, came in, said, I want this. It was business as usual. He was really firm on what he wanted to say, because it was a business deal to him at that point.
Right.
And when it was wrapping up, I said, well, I think that's everything. Is there anything else I could do for you? And the man in the business suit looked across from me and just, his eyes got sort of heavy, and he just says, can you bring my mommy back?
Wow.
Yeah. You just sort of go like, oh my God, like we just stripped everything away from this man. And that was, it was almost like this giant robot that he had been operating, and inside at the controls was still this little boy,
Right. No, I can't imagine having to, it's one thing to sort of come across someone casually in that, in that kind of frame of mind, but, you're dealing with people like that every day. That would be...
Oh, it's worse than that. When I was working at a funeral home in San Diego purely as a funeral arranger, so there was no prep work, it was all just services, standard, I had a 10 o'clock, a 12 o'clock, a 2 o'clock, and a 4 o'clock every day. So on 4 separate occasions, every day, 5 days a week, you were walking into this situation that would just punch you in the face, like time and time again. Beautiful in a weird, sort of macabre way. The whole process, I left that field marveling at its beauty in the midst of all of its tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I'm sure one of the burning questions that people have on their minds when they find out what it was you did for a living is they want to know what's the weirdest thing that you've ever seen.
I do get that question a lot. But I have to sort of put a caveat in and say this. Weird is relative. So to me, as I said, I may not understand putting Dad in a taffeta dress, but you know what? It's not up to me. And Dad certainly got it, and the daughter certainly got it. So there's that. There's the custom, like the Asian custom where they'll put things in the casket like blankets and that kind of thing. I may not understand that. I do, but I don't. So, it's not up to me to label it weird. That said, within the family dynamic, there's always weirdness. I did a service once that a sister was not allowed. They said that she is not allowed in here because she was some family thing.
Mm-hmm.
Middle of the service, she showed up and walked to the front of the church and was gazing at her mom. And I saw her brother get up out of the family box and walk across the front of the church. I thought he was going to greet her. And instead, he socked her in the face, knocked her to the ground, and literally dragged her out of the church by her hair.
Wow. As
a funeral director, you go, I kept thinking, should I step into this? This is crazy. But
yeah, how do you decide? If you've got some members saying, no, this person can't be there, and then obviously, the person wants to say goodbye to his or her mom, like, how do you determine?
Right. Well, it really comes down to, it's a legality thing. The person with the right of disposition, there's like a hierarchy about eldest son, and then it sort of goes down from there. It's their show, for want of a better word, and they're paying the bills, and so that's you kind of defer to them. Hopefully that kind of stuff doesn't happen. you know. But then there's the guy who couldn't understand why we couldn't serve wine at the visitation. Like, because I don't have a liquor license, number one. You know, so are those weird? You quickly learn that you just go, all right, this is what we're doing, you know, and you sort of try to embrace it that way. So that's sort of the personal dynamic. And then you get the other side of it, the prep room side of it, where you see not so much weird, but just you hear of the manner in which people die. And it seems so, at times it can seem so Rube Goldbergish. And I'm purposely being ambiguous about these stories because, of course, I don't want to mention names or things that are too specific. But we did a service for a guy who, him and his girlfriend were driving in their car, and they wrecked their car. They hit a pole. He was ejected. She was in the car, and she looked at him sitting on. He was fine, sitting on the ground, and he sort of looked at her and waved his hand like, I'm okay. And she was like, oh my God, he's okay. That's so great. And then behind him, one of the power lines that they had knocked off the pole, when they hit the pole, sort of is flopping around behind him, and no one saw it until it hit him.
Wow.
And just lit him up. You know, that kind of thing is, you just can't even imagine what that's like. Here's a story I hope I can make it through, because I never usually can, but we'll try. A man went to work that day. His wife and 3 children got in their car and drove to Mexico to visit some of their relatives. They were waiting at a light at the bottom of a hill. Behind them, coming down the hill, was a truck, a gas truck. The gas truck started hitting cars that were waiting at the light and just picking them up like pocket change. You know what I'm saying? And then the entire ball of metal slid into a gas station, and the entire thing exploded. So this gentleman went to work, kissed his wife and children goodbye, and then when he came home, there were cops at his house. And they said, you need to sit down because we have to tell you something.
Wow.
Now, and any day you think your job sucks, that guy's job sucks. I mean, there's no way around that. Flash forward, we're doing the service. I set up the chapel, and there is one adult casket and 3 small caskets at the head of the chapel. So that right there, that's a kick in the chest as well. We let the father in to come in to see if everything met his requirements, and he walked up to the smallest casket, I remember, and started pounding on it, like knocking on it. And he started, as he was crying, he kept saying to his son, "Come on, you've got to wake up. We're going to go fishing." Sorry. I knew that was going to happen. And it just rips your heart out, man. It just is something that's impossible to reconcile. But you have to, you know? Sorry.
It's okay.
So, this is what we're talking about. 8 to 5 days a week. That's what they're dealing with. Aside from the tactile things of trying to, in some cases, piece together something that the family can keep with them and make them feel like it's all going to be okay.
Right.
Because in the moment, ain't nothing going to be okay for that guy. Not for a long, long time. So, I knew that was going to happen at least once.
It's okay. So, at the end of the day, do you recommend the career?
I think, yes. To the proper person, yes. There are moments, as I've said, of sheer and unadulterated beauty in there, and it's an honor to be in the room. On the other hand, you're selling things at the end of the day to people who don't want to buy, but they have to buy. You know what I mean? And that kind of blows. And as long as you're working for a firm that understands that and their motivations are pure, I highly recommend the field. Sadly, a lot of firms out there aren't altruistic, and they're in it for the money, and I don't want to say they don't give a shit, but the thing they care about, the family's well-being, is sort of second or third on the list, I think. So, I saw moments that were just amazing, you know? And then there are the moments where you just realize how tenuous it all is. And for me, that I try to internalize it so where it's the samurai ethic of I may die at any day, so today needs to be a really good day. You know what I mean?
Yes. And
you try to embrace that, but then, you know, real life gets in the way, and that's, you know, the person in front of you is using coupons and you want to throttle them. But you try to realize and keep your eye on what's really important and separate from the creature comforts of, you know, money and food and a nice house and all the other stuff. And you try to focus more on, at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, you know, how do I want to be remembered, or what do I want people to think about me?
So you've seen the 6 Feet Under series, right?
Yes.
What character can you most relate to out of that series as far as, like, being sort of realistic?
I'll say this. Freddie Rodriguez, who played Rico, the prep room guy.
Right, the Latino.
Yeah, he was the closest to anyone recognizable. The Michael C. Hall character was... I met many people like them. Unfortunately, I think the show got off track and started to be more about who he was having sex with and anything to do with the show. But the first season of that series was fairly close to how things go, and then they got a little crazy with giving everyone some sort of a problem. You know what I mean?
Right, like any kind of series.
Yeah, like any kind of series. Yeah, that sooner or later they can't help themselves but, you know, mess around with it. But the Freddie Rodriguez character and a lot of the Michael C. Hall character in the first season was very similar. Very, it's funny. Funeral directors, on one hand, are very buttoned down and conservative and sort of normal looking. On the other hand, they are some of the funniest people I've ever met in my life. They are some of the most offensive people, because the jokes the things they find funny are very, very, very dark. So on one hand, I think sitting around and having a couple drinks with some funeral directors is a great time. But on the other hand, I think if you have fragile sensibilities, they are not the people you should probably be hanging around with.
Do you feel like that show did a decent job of realistically depicting the technical aspects involved in running a funeral home?
Yeah, especially, like I say, especially the first and second season.
And I know in the show they did have actually the big conglomerate that kept trying to buy them out, which...
I had heard through the grapevine that in many ways that company was based on Service Corporation International, or SCI, who I mentioned previously. So that'll give you and the comparison was pretty apt in my opinion. So that'll give you an idea of what we were talking about with those guys.
Did you ever get to see the cremation process take place in person?
The cemeteries I worked at and the funeral homes I worked at all had operating crematoriums, but usually in the course of your day, you're so busy, and cremations happen at different intervals, and usually it's during the working hours, so you're usually busy. When I graduated Mortuary College, though, we did in the weirdest sort of field trip ever. We went to a cemetery in Colma, and there we got the whole tour and we saw all their stuff, and it was very, very impressive. We got to their cremation room, and the person operating the crematory introduced us to a man who I'll just call Mr. Smith, who was about to be cremated. And introduced, just basically said, "This is Mr. Smith." Mr. Smith wasn't saying too much in return.
Right.
Right. So they slid him into the crematory, turned it on. You heard gas going and the explosion of sort of, anytime you light flame. And then they proceeded every 10 minutes or so they would open the crematory door and allow us to look inside. So it takes a couple hours to do, and we sat there the entire time and just would peek in, and you'd see the flames on the box and the box burning, and then it sort of proceeds through. And it was fascinating. In a weird way, sort of made me more comfortable with the idea of cremation, but also solidified in my mind that I'm not a real big fan of it.
Right.
For myself.
Do you think that they do a pretty good job of dealing with the dead and the collection of the ashes, or, they're a little more careless than you would think?
You have to understand that the entire funeral industry is governed by the Federal Trade Commission, and they come down like a ton of bricks if they start to, you start doing things a little hinky financially. And then there are other governing bodies that sort of keep an eye, because what you don't want to do is commingle cremains. You want to be reasonably assured that everything in that urn is indeed what was left over after the cremation of your loved one. And most of that is going to be pulverized bone, that kind of thing. There's not a lot of ash, because remember what I said, it's mostly water. You're mostly water. So usually at the end of the cremation, you've got basically a pile of bones that are left, and teeth and that kind of thing. That's all collected. The crematory is allowed to cool. Everything is gathered, swept out, and ultimately put into what is something that's called a pulverizer. And what the pulverizer is just a big machine that breaks everything into manageable little chunks. But they're watched pretty heavily, and there have been many lawsuits over people doing things that are less than correct. For example, there was a guy in Georgia, I want to say, who they found not only was he not burning bodies, but he was burning like 2 or 3 at a time and just sort of parting them out. Like, that's about this guy's worth, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of checks and balances in all of this, in the entire field. I mean, just like the teachers were looking for cracks in people's veneer, usually at a funeral home, you're kind of watching each other, not predatorily, but the idea of like, you want to see if someone's a little tired, if someone's not handling a certain case very well, or whatever, and with time, I think that part of you gets walled off.
Right.
But there's so many people involved that, you hear stories, and people love to think that a lot of weirdness goes on there, but remarkably little.
A technical question.
Yes.
Where does all the blood go when you guys, during the embalming process?
It all goes into a sump and is held as biohazard.
What is the worst shape you've ever seen someone's remains in? And can somebody insist on an open casket if it's like very... like irreparable damage is done to their face?
First part of the question. Worst bodily condition I ever... the gentleman I mentioned with the power line was bad. The family I mentioned was bad. There was a case of a gentleman who his heart exploded after a couple of 8 balls of cocaine.
Wow.
And wasn't found for 10 days.
Wow.
That's challenging. The problem inherently is that as a funeral director, I can't say to the family, you can't do an open casket. I can say, I wouldn't recommend it based on the condition of mom or what have you. And ultimately, if they say, no, damn it, we're going to do this by hook or by crook, then it falls to the funeral director and whoever's doing restorative art to try to make it work. Usually, though, the funeral director saying, I don't recommend this, and then maybe a little sort of cursory explanation, because the odds are that someone was there, someone had to identify the body at some point, right?
Right.
So somebody knows the condition as well as you do in the family. We had someone once a guy who's wrecked his motorcycle and was pretty beat up bad. It was so bad that in order to identify, they had to go off of a tattoo on his calf. And what I had said to the family was based on the fact that that's what they were making the identification of. I can tell you right now that odds are it's not going to present a real comforting image for everybody.
Right.
So you kind of balance it out. And a lot of times people don't know what's acceptable in a funeral. They don't know what is standard. So a lot of times with the funeral director, and this is where some predatory things can happen in the sales aspect, they turn to the funeral director and says, this is what I want. Mom deserved the best. I have heard funeral directors and salespeople say that. Well, didn't mom deserve the best?
Yeah.
Well, maybe. I mean, yes, absolutely. But on the other hand, when I say to you that mom can have the best, and the best is going to be $15,000 just for the casket, suddenly it starts to be like, oh, wait a minute,
Thank you for taking the time to answer some people's questions and talk a little bit about the industry. I know there's probably another 100 or 1,000 questions that have popped up from all of this, so maybe you can do it again. All right, so thanks again. I'm Catia C, and we will see you next time.